Sterling, you've just come back from a trip to China and you've been there several times. Australia being the lucky country, do you believe that that luck is going to continue?
Yes, I think it is going to continue. I think it's very important that we have a national conversation about what our plan is. I guess the key difference is in the 1980s, we remember the Japanese investing here in Australia. The key difference between the Japanese and the Chinese this time around is with the Japanese, they came to us and they invested and bought large parts of property in different parts of our economy. With the Chinese, there is a cultural difference that they expect us to come to them. We call that an academic, we call that the Middle Kingdom syndrome, but that's how their culture and that's how their economy is structured. And I think Australian business needs to move towards that mindset and recognise that.
And I assume that we have up to now assumed that they're just going to be huge buyers of iron ore, huge buyers of coal and other strategic commodities.
Absolutely.
And I take it there's a raft of other things we can be doing.
Absolutely. And again, it comes to that broader conversation, what is our connection with China? And from what we've been talking about in the newspaper over the last few months is that China 30 years ago adopted the globalization premise, that they basically became the manufacturing hub of the Western world. The deal was that they produced our goods and parts of our services, and in return we incrementally paid them more and more, and they became a consumer-led economy over time. They've now got to that point, and now they're fulfilling almost to the letter their obligations, and now we have the issue of what's called cost push inflation, that some of their inflation is being imported back into our economies. And as I started this conversation by saying, we now need to decide what our plan is for the next 20 or 30 years.
And how are we going to be affected by for instance, the new government in China, which, as I understand it, is trying very hard to stamp out on corruption. It's trying very hard to reduce pollution.
Yes.
And do you feel that that's not fully understood outside China?
It's not, but again, what we talked about last week in the paper is that the advantage of that Politburo policy is that with their 5-year plans, they almost, on every occasion since 1949, when the Communist Party first came into power, they've seen those 5-year plans through to fruition, even when they've had dire consequences like the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. And the advantage from an Australian or an American or a foreigner investing into China or looking to them to come and invest here is that there's some certainty with how the government is going to structure the economy, the plan to liberalise the parts of their monetary system and also their markets. Clearly there's going to be hiccups and some huge hurdles that they are currently facing. But again, the advantage of that structure is that there's transparency and there is some forward planning baked into that.
So it looks to me as though we've underestimated the Chinese ability to do what they said they would do.
Yes.
Next question really is, where do you see the big upside for Australia moving, assuming we move away from this iron ore dependent export industry?
And I guess that's the $64 million question, isn't it? And I guess it comes back to what I was starting by saying, is that we need a plan here, and we have a very competitive biomed, as we talked about last week, although there has been significantly underinvested here in Australia. We're lagging behind in IT space and in education and in the sciences, and there's a multiple ways that this economy can expand, but we need to have that conversation. And we need to look at economies like the US, who's re-engineered their manufacturing sector, that's looked at electric cars, that found different ways of moving forward.
One curly question, of course, is the intellectual property issue in China. Do you think that they're going to be more realistic about that in the future?
No. So we've got that's a huge issue.
They're going to stay that way.
Absolutely.
So that's how we've got to tailor our approach.
Yes, absolutely. And there's a lot in the international dialogue at the moment about US law and international law and English law, and how obviously the regional powers are trying to challenge that. But that's to be expected. And again, if we look back to what our experience with the Japanese, we had some of that pushback in the 80s. So again, the Australian institutions, the Australian society should have some experience to that, and we shouldn't be too paranoid.
So in summary, we're not expecting the Chinese to change their very cavalier attitude to things like intellectual property, but there's more upside than downside for Australia.
Absolutely.
Looking forward the next 5-10 years, even with this consumer-led economy.
Absolutely, and clearly that's, I guess, the key point of this, and that's a very good point that you just made, that they are moving towards a consumer-led economy, exactly as promised 30 years ago to them. And they're moving towards that, they're fulfilling their requirements, and again, we read different commentary about what they're doing with their monetary policy, but they are moving towards a more accommodative structure. And you've got to give them some accommodation that 30 years ago they came from nothing, and they've built that momentum in a very short time. And I think the obligation falls on us to think about then how do we fit into that model, and what do we contribute other than complaining that iron ore is tapering as expected, capex is clearly on the way down,
and worrying about Chinese buying farms.
Sure, but
it's
again,
a bigger picture.
Again, I'm relatively young, but I remember the same paranoia and fears about the Japanese, and clearly, again, there has to be a balance in any economy. But what we're going to talk about in the weeks ahead is about Australians investing in Asian real estate investments, and you have to, we are all part of the global economy. We sold them globalization. They've done their part, and it's now our turn to accept our responsibility in that model.
Yes, it's not really our role to bitch. Thank you very much.